All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining today's webinar on Globus Payments. Just some quick introductions. My name is Carrie Klaus, and I sit on the product marketing side of the house at Globus. And I work with a lot of our existing clients on the adoption and change management front, from initial launch to specific initiatives, and a lot of those are definitely around driving e-payment adoption. I also have John Wren joining me today. John is actually based in our Toronto office, and he really has a keen understanding of the Globus Solution Suite, and even more importantly, he has a lot of experience when it comes to systems and process integration as well. So thanks to John for joining. So to kick things off, I'm going to spend a few minutes just walking through some of our recent learnings around the B2B payment space, do a quick intro into the Globus payment product, and then I'll hand it over to John to do a demo of the product and highlight some of the key features. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to send them through via the chat function, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible towards the end of the presentation. So I wanted to just quickly provide a quick intro into Globus and how we play in the invoice to cash space. So our core is really around unifying and simplifying the invoice to cash process. So over the years, we've helped countless companies bring together invoices, as well as all of that associated data from siloed systems into a single point of access for their customers. So while this has definitely helped from a customer experience standpoint, it also has a significant impact on cost and efficiency from an operations standpoint as well. So the goal is really around leveraging our patented technology to make it easier for today's business customer to access, review, categorize, share, and then ultimately pay, while also making it super easy for the supplier to provide the invoices and process those payments as well. So we have a global reach with our client base who have implemented our suite of products among millions of business users. So one thing to point out that's unique about our solutions is the ability to scale up and down to meet the specific needs of varying segments. So while an SMB might not need cost allocation for their invoicing and payment needs, for example, they can still leverage the same platform as a complex enterprise customer. And we do that by configuring specific experiences to reflect specific needs of those different segments. So this approach has really allowed us to not only solve niche problems for specific customer segments, but also provide solutions as well as best practices that can drive positive impacts across that entire business space. And I'll do a quick plug for our Globus research panel as well. So this is a new initiative that we started this year to bring together peers to discuss a variety of topics, really all tied to the invoice to cash. And the goal is really around opening the lines of conversation between different markets, regions, industries, to really, formulate some solid insights on what's driving invoice to cash success, or the barriers that still need to be overcome as well. So there's always room for more participants. And so if this is something that would be of interest to you, please let us know and we'll get you plugged in for the next session as well. So hopping into the topic for today, in our last webinar, we spent some time discussing some recent analysis that was done to identify challenges around driving electronic B2B payments. So there was an AFP survey that was administered across several different verticals, telecom, healthcare, and utilities. And then we actually did a parallel survey of our own across that Globus research panelist group as well. So among both groups, insufficient remittance data was noted as the top barrier among the majority of respondents. So it's important to note that this applies to both the supplier from an accounts receivables perspective, as well as the customer from an accounts payable perspective. So the other barrier that came to the top was the ability to actually drive customers to adopt e-payments. So unfortunately, although some suppliers have actually enabled online payments, they haven't necessarily enabled it in an efficient way. And what I mean by that is a way that allows customers to be efficient in the way that they submit payments in the way that according to their needs, as well as an efficient way for the supplier to then process those needs on their side or process those payments on their side as well. So the lack of integration has really resulted in a pretty poor customer experience when it comes to payments. So for example, some customers have to view their invoices via one portal and then pay in another. Other customers actually, they can pay for certain products online, but not all of their products with a certain supplier. So it's really left customers kind of in a hesitant state to move to electronic payments. And the question really is, what's the value for moving online? So just another interesting thing that we found in our Globus research is that for the majority of suppliers, actually more than 50% of business revenues are actually tied to less than 10% of the business customer base. And unfortunately, as you could probably assume, those 10% are probably some of the most complex customers when it comes to invoicing and payments. So while a consumer-like experience may be sufficient for, let's say, a SOHO or even a small SMB, those big revenue customers are really looking for a digital solution that addresses the complexity of submitting payments across hundreds or even thousands of invoices. And it's important to note, suppliers need a way to then process those payments as efficiently as possible. So if you look on the right, the challenge, as we see here, is that customers are still using a lot of offline and manual methods. Again, survey results showed that 100% of the companies that were surveyed are still receiving paper checks. And although there's been some attempts to automate the process, there's still a big gap when it comes to the number of companies who have actually employed straight-through processing of payments. So again, results showed that 50% of companies have zero STP in place. And actually of that 50% who are actively using straight-through processing, most are only doing so for a fairly small portion of the payments coming in. So if we take that and say, what's really the key takeaway, it kind of is summed up by saying, manual processes are impacting the speed and cost of B2B payments. So if we look at day sales outstanding, for example, although the average payment terms for B2B is typically 28 days, DSO is actually sitting closer to the 50-day mark. Obviously, the larger the company, the more complicated the billing and AP processes. So it's not uncommon to see large enterprises or corporates actually extending that to even closer to a 70 to 75-day mark. And for suppliers, that really means that there's a lot of cash that's kind of sitting in this holding pattern in those open receivables. Referring back to the lack of the remittance data, it's not just an annoyance, but it's actually a really big contributor to inaccuracies as well. And those inaccuracies are then disputed and have to be resolved. So some suppliers actually have reported that 25% of B2B payments are mismatched. So wrong invoice, wrong account. And that's either due to a lack of data or misentry when the data is rekeyed into the different systems. And then of course, anything manual comes with high cost. So processing of offline check payments can run anywhere from, I think, $8 to $25. And that doesn't necessarily take into account the time required by the supplier's AR resources to actually do all of that manual processing as well. So manual matching of payments, reformatting of the remittance data that's coming in, again, investigating and resolving those disputes, updating of the backend systems. So all of this is super time intensive, and obviously with that time comes cost. So if we hop into kind of the problem and boil it down a bit, it's really about the disconnect between payments and remittance. So we've got a little bit of a visual here just to kind of walk through the process and outline some of the issues causing this. So your AR team has an accounting structure, for each of your customers, and each month those invoices are produced for each customer, and depending on your backend structure, this is either coming from a single billing system or perhaps multiple systems feeding those invoices in, and then they're distributed over to the customer. So the customer's AP team is then responsible for connecting those invoices into their accounting structure that exists today. So the challenge is really around knowing which invoices should be allocated to which nodes within their chart of accounts. This visual actually makes it seem fairly simple given 3 invoices and a few nodes, but clearly this grows in complexity depending on the customer size and the amount of business done with the supplier. So once they determine proper allocation, the customer decides how they'll pay against those outstanding totals. So if they always said, we'll make a single full payment against each invoice, things would remain fairly simple. But as we know, that's not typically how it is. It's not that straightforward. So this customer, for example, knows that all 3 of these invoices belong to this specific group within their organization. So as opposed to making 3 separate transactions, they actually want to combine those into a single transaction across all 3 of those invoices. So depending on the payment channel or the method used, customers will send some form of remittance advice through. So typically this is either coming via email, a document, perhaps an application itself if it's submitted through an online payment application. But unfortunately, this is where we often see kind of the lost in translation start to happen. So the original invoice structure is now replaced by how the customer has redefined based on how the payments were made. Sometimes the required remittance data is there, but it has to be manually extracted and translated to a form that the AR system can ingest. Sometimes the data is actually lacking, which begins kind of the roundabout for trying to match and validate. And then that often requires interaction or several interactions with the customers themselves. So again, a view with 3 invoices in one customer doesn't really do this problem justice. But when you think of how this grows in complexity, when you have hundreds of invoices per customer and then thousands of customers, the extent of the problem really becomes clear. So what's the solution? The goal with straight-through processing is really to remove the manual error-prone processes and interventions to ensure payments are processed as efficiently as well as accurately as possible. So it really starts with allowing the customer to build a digital invoicing and payment structure based on how they operate, not on how you invoice. So they have their chart of accounts that we've called out to the left, and they need to organize the payments and their invoices to reflect this view. So as I showed in the previous view, these personalized payments, which we like to call them, it's happening today, but most of them are being done in an offline, very manual, document-based process. So the goal here is to enable customers to perform all of these tasks online, which offers a big time savings to them, but also has significant efficiencies for the supplier. So what's key is being able to decipher how those payments are then reconciled back to the original invoice in that account structure. So here, although the customer chose to consolidate those payments into a single transaction, we can see that the original invoice structure is maintained and that we have kind of a data path that's automatically transmitted when the customer hits pay now. So there's no back and forth with the customer. There's no deciphering files to connect the dots. And really the goal is for the AR system to receive the remittance data that is required to close out the process. So if we jump into some of the specifics around Globus Payments, again, it really starts with making it easy for your customers to pay you. And again, this goes from your smallest business customers all the way up to your largest corporates. So John will actually show these features when we hop into the demo, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to point out a few things for each one of them. I would say, the first 2, the ePay and the AutoPay, these are really the baseline for providing an e-payment experience to your business customers. So this functionality is fairly similar to what we all experience in our consumer life. So having a digital application to log in, review our invoices in one place, and then submit payments with a variety of payment options. Again, I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of AutoPay, but it's important to note that this can be, a real game changer actually from a business perspective. So not only does it have an impact on your DSO, but also adopters of this automated feature are typically less likely to raise inquiries and disputes as well. So it not only automates the process for the customer, but it simplifies the process and kind of provides a proactive and predictive process for you as well. You'll see I noted the multi-pay in green. This is really where customers can begin to kind of build those personalized payments that I was referencing earlier. So allowing them to say how invoices are consolidated and how invoices are processed. For organizations with several payments personnel, So if multiple people need to be able to access the system, perform payment tasks, the solution actually allows someone at an admin level to determine, who has access and what specific payment tasks can be performed. So such as adding or editing payment sources and actually making those payments on a monthly basis as well. The payment categories that we mentioned, this is really where customers can organize their invoices and outstanding balances based on either their hierarchy structure, which is integrated within the application, or some other grouping categories as well. So again, the goal around this is to really take something that customers are doing offline today and move it to a digital state to expedite their validation and payment processes. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention Globus Payments also provides omni-channel support. So those customers who are still paying via check, although they may not move to 100% online way of doing business, this can kind of serve as a transition point between the offline and online from a remittance standpoint. And John will talk through that as well. So before we hop into the demo, just in terms of the how, there's really three components tied to how Globus enables STP for B2B payments. So the first is the remittance generation. So again, without a templated or digital option from the supplier, what's happening today is customers are sending remittance via varying document-based formats. So some of these are missing the required data elements. Some can't be consumed by the supplier's legacy AR system, so it requires resources to actually convert those into formats that can be digested. They require manual matching and rekeying of data into the AR system. So again, the goal around this is standardizing and digitizing the format and the detail of the remittance data that comes from the customer. So essentially, we want to remove the onus from the customer and standardize the process by generating the required remittance for you based on the invoice data and the customer payment options that they've selected. In terms of integrating with AR, this is really understanding what your AR system needs in order to link remittance to payments, and then integrating directly, typically via API, to feed that information from the Globus solution. And then last, but obviously not least, is automating this process in its entirety. So again, the goal of removing the manual processes that are slow and costly. We really want to be able to automate the process of providing the required remittance data to ensure a higher degree of matching between the customer remittance and the payment data from your payment gateway providers. So with that, I am going to hand it over to John for the demo.
Great, thank you, Carrie. So one of the challenges that we see facing customers in the payment process is that manual process of invoice consolidation that Carrie has mentioned. And that can introduce errors and delay the payments that customers are making. Typically, customer accounts payable staff will receive a multitude of invoices through a variety of sources, whether they be paper, email, or different online portals. And when they receive invoices in those forms, they're required to re-enter the data into spreadsheets or external systems to achieve any sort of invoice consolidation or perform analysis. So one of our main goals at Globus is to directly solve that challenge by allowing your customer to see their invoices across all of their accounts, all of their products and systems in a single location. So we will store multiple months of invoices and data, maintaining invoice history and allowing for the service provider initiatives like paperless billing through that multiple months of storage, and also reducing requests for invoices to be resent to customers because they can now get them online. We also have search capabilities to find invoices meeting a customer specific criteria. So if they're looking for a specific invoice amongst many, they have a number of ways to find those within the application. Now, the Accounts Payable Manager has a number of options for invoice consolidation within our application. If they're using our hierarchy capability that Carrie mentioned. They can group by department or by cost center or node. And we also have a number of other configurable options that they can choose from, like service type, due date, etc. But simply by clicking that button, you can see that we've now grouped their invoices according to their department structure, and it makes it much, much easier if your corporate policy is to pay by department to do that in an automated fashion. An accounts payable manager can also easily sort the invoices according to their preference through the columns provided here. So they could choose to sort by invoice date, by the source of the invoice coming to them, or even by payment status. Once they've done that, they typically would have to come in and review and pay invoices one at a time. But with Globus, the AP manager can multi-pay, as Carrie mentioned. So they can come in and select any number of invoices that they require to pay through the application, and then view those as a virtual consolidated invoice. That saves time and effort, especially for some of your larger customers. So the first step, usually when I see an invoice or an accounts payable manager is coming in to pay their invoice, is to review their costs compared to expected or previous charges. So within Globus, we have a month-over-month comparison feature. And with this, the AP manager can quickly scan their bill for anomalies between month-over-month or expenses that they were expecting or not expecting. And because they have the full visibility of their invoices and all of the details associated with it, the AP manager will become accustomed to seeing these expenses and the patterns, and over time they will build trust in the billing and payment process. And we find that that leads to greater satisfaction and loyalty within the whole relationship with the customer. For many of our customers, we find that this virtual invoice is the only way for their business customers to see a consolidated invoice. We've helped clients who have grown by acquisition or that have multiple legacy backend systems bring together invoices from those different systems without having the pain and the expense or the risk of a large replacement project. So it has saved a lot of time and money on the system consolidation side for our customers who have implemented the Globus application. Now, once an accounts payable manager has reviewed their virtual invoice, it'll be time to pay. A single payment can be made with the total amount due, or it can be divided into groups. And it's really about allowing the customer to pay their way, as Carrie mentioned, making it quick and easy for an accounts payable manager to follow their corporate policies, but still be able to pay invoices within a few clicks. Payments can also be scheduled within the application, and that allows for an accounts payable manager to come in a single visit and make all of their payment tasks in one visit without having to log in multiple times during the month. The Globus Payments capability supports electronic funds transfer and credit card payments, as we mentioned. And also we support the auto pay feature so that customers don't even need to log in and can save even more time and pay you faster and more reliably. Now, one other feature that we offer, which is not shown on the screen, is that external payment feature that Carrie mentioned. And what we do there is a very similar approach where they can pay by mail. All of the remittance information that is captured in these columns and fields are then recorded and provided to the service provider for reconciliation, as well as a transaction file associated with that for the customer to record on their check. Now, once they submit their payment, the Globus payment engine in the background will integrate the payment gateway with a payment gateway if you have that, and confirm the payments. And after that payment confirmation, the Globus payment engine sends remittance advice to each original invoice on your accounts receivables for automatic reconciliation, making the process simple, hopefully for you and also for your customers. So with that, I'll hand the microphone back over to Carrie for the wrap up and continuation.
Thanks, John. So let me just grab this back real quick. Perfect. So before we hop into questions, I just wanted to highlight a few specific use cases and some of the associated success that we've seen with some of our clients specific to the payments front. So on this first one on the left, really around focused on accelerating cash flow and improving that day sales outstanding. So in this specific example, Globus actually brought together multiple invoicing systems and became the single point of online payment for the entire business space. So again, all the way from SMB all the way up to the larger corporates as well. And it actually was across their North American market and European market as well. So two different geographies brought into that. And in analyzing the DSO, we found a 65% improvement between customers who are now making online payments through the Globus application versus those who are still relying on paper invoices and offline payments. So obviously a big driver in terms of getting, number one, users onto the online from an invoicing perspective, but then taking it to the next level and getting them to submit those payments online as well. In terms of operational efficiency, so we had another client with a major initiative to improve the business customer experience, and they were really looking at it from a holistic point of view. So how quickly customers were receiving their bills, all the way to how quickly payments were being reconciled. So one of the major inefficiencies identified was all of the manual handoffs and processes that were happening in order to reach settlement of a payment. So, and this is especially when customers were submitting, a single payment across multiple invoices. So again, that lack of remittance data was really having an impact on how much time and effort was required to get those to a state of closure. So by automating the distribution of the remittance advice, like John and I talked through, across the multiple systems, this really was able to move from a time frame of settlement in days to minutes. And again, a lot of this was eliminating that back and forth and questions back to the customer and having kind of that direct matching in between those. Another one worth noting just from an operating cost perspective, so by removing the manual processes associated with offline payments and collections, this specific client actually has realized a cost savings of 50%, maybe even be higher by now when comparing the processing cost of offline to online payments. It's also worth noting that this specific customer, they've done a lot of initiatives to drive online transactions and have really simplified that in the sense that there's one place where customers can pay online and pay for all of their products and services online. And they really made it the default, especially within their SMB base. So in turn, they've actually achieved greater than 50% autopay adoption among those e-payment business users, which is some of the best adoption that we've seen, not only in the Globus client base, but just from an industry perspective as well. And then lastly, in terms of approach, wanted to point out one client in the Middle East who actually made the decision to integrate their existing e-payment functionality within their Globus digital invoicing portal. So this not only had impacts on the volumes and values of online transactions that were coming through, but we also saw an increase in the adoption of the portal itself. So again, by integrating those two together, not only drove more transactions online, but also, again, has increased the digital invoicing adoption as well. So with that, I'm going to do a quick check to see if any questions have come in. All right, John, I'm going to hand this one over to you. It says, we already have payment gateways in place. How do you integrate with those existing systems and processes?
Thanks, Carrie. Good question. Globus has an API layer, which we use to integrate with many payment gateways. And we perform the steps that I showed in the demo to capture the data. Sometimes we use the screens of the payment gateway to capture that data. Sometimes we use our own. And then the payment instructions are passed from Globus to the payment processor via API for processing. And then the information will also be passed along to the service provider so that the information is accurate and synchronized between the systems. Now, it's important to mention as well that when we work with payment gateways, we are PCI compliant. We do not store the full credit card information in the Globus application, but rather tokenize and pass that along to the payment processor itself. So all of those steps are in place with our application. And as I say, we've integrated to many of the common gateways and can easily bring in more as they come on stream.
Great, thanks, John. So this one kind of plays into the security as well, a little bit of a different take, but since you touched on security of controlling who can make payments, can you give a bit more detail on how that is managed?
Sure. So there's two places where we do that. One is in our setup of the application and the types of users that come in. So we have an administrative user who has the ability to provide permissions to other users of the application. And we will have a fine-grained permissions capabilities. So if the customer is allowed to make payments, if that user is allowed to make payments, that's one of the permissions. They can also have a permission to edit the payment methods within the application. So we have a number of fine-grained permissions within. However, in some cases with our service providers, we are integrated with them through single sign-on and are part of their overall business portal. And in those single sign-on cases, the permissions can be passed from the service provider to us, and we will we coordinate with them on the capabilities as they're passed through to us for the user in their session.
Yep, that's great. So I don't see any other questions that have come through, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up and give you a little bit of your time back. Feel free, if you have any questions that come up, feel free to reach out to John or myself, or info@globus.com is always a good way to initiate contact with us as well. And we will be sending out a recording of the webinar, so feel free to pass that along to any colleagues. And also, always interested to hear, what other topics may be of interest. So if you have any feedback, that would be great to feed through as well. So thanks again for joining and have a great day.